You edit yourself before you even open your mouth. Not once, not occasionally. Every single time the group gets loud, every time the conversation accelerates and bodies lean in, and someone's voice rises above the rest, you measure the distance between what you actually think and what you're about to say, and you cut, you trim, you soften the edges until what comes out is either so diluted it barely sounds like you, or you say nothing at all and sit there watching your own thought dissolve. And the worst part, the part nobody talks about, is that you do it so fast you barely notice it happening anymore. The self-editing isn't a conscious choice, it's a reflex. You've been doing it so long it feels like thinking, but it isn't. It's erasure. And it happens in the half second before your mouth opens, in the split second when you calculate whether what you're about to say is worth the cost of saying it. They've called it being an introvert. They've called it being passive, being reserved, being difficult to read. They've handed you labels the way a customs officer hands back a passport. Here, this is what you are. Move along. But here is the thing about those labels. They describe the outside of the behavior without touching what is actually happening on the inside. They name the symptom and call it the disease. They see you holding back and assume you have nothing to say. They see the silence and mistake it for emptiness. There is something underneath all of this, underneath the self-editing and the measured silence and the habit of making yourself smaller in rooms full of people, that has nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with something much more precise. Something that, once you see it clearly, changes the entire story you've been telling yourself about why you do this. We are going to get there, but not yet. It started early. Earlier than you probably remember as a distinct event, which is part of what makes it so durable. You learned in fragments, not in a single lesson. A comment at a dinner table, a classroom where the loud kids got called on and you didn't, a friend group where the social currency was volume and confidence, and you kept spending money you didn't have, trying to match an exchange rate that was never in your favor. At some point, and you can probably identify the age if you sit with it, you started learning that your contribution to a conversation had to be earned before it was offered. Other people spoke and were heard automatically. You spoke and felt the air pressure change slightly, felt the micro adjustments in the room, the moment where someone's eyes drifted or someone else talked louder and the window closed. So you started doing the math before speaking. Is this worth it? Will this land? Will this be dismissed? And the calculation became faster and faster until it became invisible. By the time you were old enough to understand what was happening, the habit was already structural. It had been built into the way you entered rooms, the way you positioned your body at tables, the way you tracked who was speaking and where the gaps were, and whether those gaps were actually invitations or just pauses that belonged to someone else. So here you are now, in a meeting, in a social group, in a conversation with 3 or more people present. And this is the internal monologue running behind your eyes. Someone makes a point you disagree with. Your brain formulates a response. Then, immediately, before the response reaches your mouth, a second voice activates. That voice says, "Is this the right moment?" And then, "Is this worth the friction?" And then, "They're probably going to keep talking anyway." And then, someone else will say something, and it'll move on. And it does move on. It always moves on. And you sit there holding a thought that will never be heard, watching the conversation go somewhere. It might not have gone if you'd spoken, and the thought doesn't disappear. It just gets filed into a cabinet that keeps getting fuller. That filing cabinet is heavy. You've been carrying it across every job, every relationship, every social environment you've moved through. It weighs something. And the weight isn't anxiety in the clinical sense, though it can look like anxiety from the outside. The weight is the accumulated cost of every moment you talked yourself out of taking up the space that was yours to take. Here is what trying to suppress it looks like. You decide, before the next social event, that you're going to speak more. You're going to contribute. You rehearse how you'll enter the conversation. And then you're in the room and the volume rises and the tempo accelerates and the whole calculation machine fires back up automatically, and by the end of the evening you've said a quarter of what you intended and you're driving home running a quiet internal audit of what went wrong. The answer isn't that you failed. The answer is that you tried to override a deeply conditioned response through willpower alone, which is approximately as effective as trying to stop a reflex by thinking about it. You can't decide your way out of a pattern this old. You have to understand it first. 10. Understanding it means asking the real question. Not the surface question, not why am I so quiet, or why can't I just speak up, but the question underneath that one. The question this whole pattern forces you to face once you strip away the self-help language and the comfortable abstractions. The real question is this: do you actually believe that what you think is worth the cost of someone else's discomfort? Not worth saying, worth the cost. Because at the core of every editing decision you make in a group conversation, there is a split-second judgment, and in that judgment, you consistently price yourself below the social comfort of the room, every time, without exception. That is not shyness. That is a belief about your own value that has been running so long it feels like a personality trait. Point 1. The label is not just wrong. It is describing the wrong thing entirely. Shyness is a temperamental tendency towards social withdrawal rooted in anxiety about negative evaluation. What you have is not that. What you actually have is a high threshold for speaking, a filter that activates before you contribute, because your brain runs a full quality and relevance assessment before output. That is not withdrawal. That is editing. And editing is not a social deficiency. Editing is what separates signal from noise. The problem with calling this shyness is that it medicates the wrong organ. If you believe you're shy, you try to force yourself to speak more, to be louder, to perform confidence you don't feel, because shy is the condition and volume is the cure. But your actual condition isn't a deficit of volume. It's a surplus of filtering in environments that penalize filtering. You're not failing to speak. You're refusing to speak carelessly. The label your social environment handed you was never a diagnosis. It was a complaint dressed up as a description. You are not shy. You are precise, and precision in a world that rewards noise will always look, from the outside, like silence. Point 2. This trait did not come from weakness. It came from calibration. Point. Go back to where the filtering started. It didn't appear randomly. It developed in response to an environment, most likely an early one, where the cost of saying the wrong thing was real, where being wrong out loud had social consequences, where the space to think before speaking either didn't exist or was taken away fast enough that you learned to complete the thinking before the mouth opened. That is not psychological damage. That is adaptive intelligence. Your nervous system observed a pattern, unfiltered output produces negative outcomes, and developed a processing mechanism to reduce risk. The mechanism worked. It protected you. In the environment that produced it, it was exactly the right tool. The problem is that adaptive responses don't come with an expiration date. They don't automatically retire when the environment changes. The filtering mechanism you developed to survive one context followed you into every subsequent context, including ones where the original threat no longer exists. What was once protection became habit, and what became habit became identity. Flaw. You built a survival tool in the wrong century and forgot to update the software. 5. Point 3. The people who judge this trait most loudly are telling you exactly who they are. Pay attention to who gets visibly frustrated by your measured silence, who reads your thoughtfulness as aloofness, who interprets your refusal to speak carelessly as arrogance or detachment or social failure. These are, almost universally, people for whom verbal fluency is the primary measure of intelligence and engagement, people for whom speed of output is synonymous with depth of thought. They have built their social identity around the ability to hold a room, to be loud in the right ways at the right moments, to fill silence before it becomes uncomfortable. They are not wrong to operate this way. In many social environments, that skill is genuinely valuable. But their discomfort with your processing style is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that your cognitive tempo doesn't match theirs, and that they have decided their tempo is the correct one. When someone tells you that you need to speak up more, they are almost always saying, "Your way of processing the world makes me uncomfortable, and I'd prefer you change it so that I don't have to sit with that discomfort." That is not insight. That is preference framed as diagnosis. Asterisk, their impatience with your silence is not about your limitations, it is about theirs. Asterisk point 4. When this trait is not suppressed, it produces something specific and rare. Asterisk body. There is a particular kind of value that only enters a conversation after other people have finished performing, after the first wave of opinions has landed, after the most obvious positions have been staked, after the verbal jockeying has revealed what everyone already believed before they walked in. That is, when the person who has been listening with full attention, not waiting to speak but actually listening, can say something that reframes the entire conversation. One sentence that lands differently than everything before it, because it is informed by everything before it, because it didn't arrive first, because it was built on what the room produced, not on what the speaker came in wanting to say. That capacity for observation-based, precisely timed contribution is not a common one. Most people in group settings are in broadcast mode. They are managing their own image, tracking their own ideas, waiting for the opening to insert what they already wanted to say. They are not listening. They are reloading. You are not reloading. You are receiving. And a mind that receives fully before it transmits is capable of contributions that a mind in broadcast mode will never produce. The person who speaks last and says the thing that changes the room is not behind the conversation. They have been running it from the inside. Asterisk fistal. Point 5. The difference between this trait being your damage and being your strength is what you do with the filter. Asterisk. When this trait is suppressed, when you take the filter and turn it all the way up because the environment has trained you that no output is safer than risky output, it doesn't disappear. It turns inward. The processing continues, but without an output channel it becomes ruminative. You replay conversations afterward. You construct the perfect response at midnight for something that happened at noon. You accumulate the filing cabinet and carry it heavier every year. When this trait is misdirected, when you use the filter not to find the right moment, but to avoid every moment, it doesn't protect you anymore. It isolates you. And isolation confirms the original belief. What you think isn't worth the cost. The habit and the belief feed each other until both feel like facts. But when this trait is acknowledged, when you stop treating the filter as a flaw and start treating it as an instrument, something different becomes possible. The filter becomes selective rather than total. You stop trying to override it and start working with it. You identify the moments where you have something worth saying, and instead of running the full cost-benefit calculation, you say it. Not because you've become fearless, because you've decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of being heard. Asterisk, this trait has never been the problem. Believing it was the problem has been the problem. Asterisk, the internal language you use to describe this trait is part of what keeps it locked in place. When you tell yourself, "I don't speak up," or "I'm bad in groups," or "I'm too quiet," you are using language that frames the trait as a deficit, as something missing, something broken. And the mind responds to deficits by trying to compensate, which is why every attempt to fix this through willpower ends with you forcing volume you don't feel in contexts that don't require it. The replacement isn't affirmation language, it's precision language. It's precision language. Instead of "I'm too quiet," the internal statement becomes, I am a high-filter communicator in a low-filter environment. Instead of "I don't speak up," the statement becomes "I haven't identified the right entry point yet." The shift is subtle, but it changes the entire cognitive posture. You are no longer someone who failed to speak. You are someone who hasn't spoken yet, and those two positions lead to completely different behaviors. This matters because the brain follows the frame. If the frame is deficit, the behavior becomes compensation. If the frame is operating style, the behavior becomes strategy. Same room, same conversation, radically different internal experience of what your silence means. Not all environments are neutral toward your operating style. Some environments are structurally designed for high-filter communicators, places where depth is valued over speed, where listening is considered a contribution, where the conversation has pauses built into it rather than racing to fill them. Those environments exist. They are not common, but they exist. And then there are environments designed for broadcast mode communication, high volume, fast tempo, social reward for quantity of output, status determined by who controls the conversation. These environments are not broken, they are just not calibrated for the way you think. And spending the majority of your time in environments that structurally penalize your operating style is not a character-building exercise. It is attrition. The audit is simple, but uncomfortable. Look at the environments where you spend the most time professionally, socially, personally, and identify honestly which ones are configured for you and which ones are configured against you. This is not permission to withdraw from difficult environments. It is information. Knowing that a given room is structurally low filter doesn't mean you'll leave. It means you stop measuring your performance there against a standard that was never designed for how you think. You are not performing badly in environments that penalize your traits. You are performing in the wrong environment. Those are different problems with different solutions. The next time someone tells you that you need to speak up more, or that you seem checked out, or that they can't read you, and there will be a next time, you do not need to explain yourself, and you do not need to defend yourself. You need two sentences, internal sentences, not for them, for you. The first sentence, this person is telling me their preference, not the truth about me. The second sentence, I am not obligated to calibrate my cognitive tempo to their comfort, time. That is the complete protocol. You do not have to recite it out loud. You do not have to argue with them. You hold those two sentences internally. They act as a cognitive reset, and you return to the conversation without having absorbed the judgment into your self-concept, because that is what usually happens. Someone voices their frustration with your silence, and without meaning to, you file it under evidence. Evidence that you are in fact deficient in some way. The protocol interrupts the filing. The external response, if one is warranted, can be as simple as, I tend to think before I speak. No apology, no elaboration, a statement, and then you return to listening, because that is where your actual work happens. The mental posture of someone who has stopped treating this trait as a liability looks like this. They walk into a group conversation, and they do not begin by calculating how to appear more engaged than they feel, or how to insert themselves at a frequency that seems normal, or how to preemptively manage how they're being perceived. They walk in knowing that their contribution is going to come when it comes, when the moment is right and the observation is formed. And they are not apologetic about the space between now and then. They are not performing patience. They are not suppressing urgency. They genuinely are not in a hurry to speak, because they know that the value of what they contribute is not diminished by arriving late in the conversation. It is often improved by it. That posture is not arrogance. Arrogance assumes superiority. This is something quieter and more durable than arrogance. This is simply knowing how you work and no longer pretending that you work differently. Here is the larger pattern you've been living inside of, and it is worth naming it directly. You have spent most of your social life measuring yourself against a standard of social performance that was built by and for a specific cognitive style: high volume, low latency, broadcast first. That standard is not neutral. It was constructed by people whose natural operating mode happens to match the dominant cultural expectation for engagement. And they built the measuring stick from the only material they had, which was themselves. That standard is not wrong in the way a lie is wrong. It accurately describes one way of being in the world. It just was never designed to describe yours, and you have been holding yourself against it for long enough that you've mistaken the gap for a deficiency, as if the ruler is correct and you are the thing that fails to measure up. You are being measured with the wrong instrument. Here is what is actually true about you, right now, not as a compliment and not as reassurance, but as an observable fact. You notice things other people in the room do not notice. You hold complexity in conversation longer than most people are willing to. You have the ability to be fully present in a room without needing to announce your presence, and you consistently underestimate how much the quality of a conversation shifts when you finally do speak, because you are not often in the room to witness what your contribution does once it lands. The people who benefit most from your presence are often not the ones who tell you so. They are the ones who, an hour after the conversation ends, find themselves still turning over the thing you said. The ones who bring it up a week later. The ones who don't know how to articulate why your particular silence, followed by your particular words, was the thing that made the conversation worth having. You will not stop editing entirely. The filter is not going to dissolve because you've watched this video. What can change? What changes when understanding actually shifts something rather than just rearranging the furniture? Is the relationships you have with the filter, whether you carry it as evidence of a flaw or as the instrument of a specific, irreplaceable kind of intelligence. You do not need permission to take up space. Permission implies someone else holds the rights to your presence. No one does. The room does not belong to whoever speaks loudest. It belongs, in equal measure, to everyone in it, including the person who has been sitting quietly in the corner, building the sentence that will outlast everything else said that day. The only intervention that was ever needed was this: stop editing yourself into someone else's idea of how a person should sound, and start letting yourself be exactly as deliberate, exactly as careful, and exactly as precisely heard as you actually are. You were never too quiet. The room was just too loud to hear you.